Welcome to ClimateGenn. I recorded this interview with Professor Kevin Anderson via Zoom from Baku in the last days of COP29. Kevin provides some critical insights into how the headlines we often see reported break down from a numerical standpoint. Although the COPs remain an important component of our overall global diplomatic approach to this complex existential problem, there are no signals that the promise of the Paris Agreement will be kept by the nations who repeatedly pledge to hold to it. So what do we do? Here Kevin offers a range of his insights. With the clock ticking and human greed still in charge of the agenda, our collective agency and actions matter much more than we can ever imagine. Thank you for listening. There are many more episodes on the way. Please subscribe to support this work, or you can order my book Cop Out and join me on the journey from COP21 to 28 to see how we have ended up in this mess and why we urgently need to break the pattern. Thank you.
So Kevin, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining me at COP29 in Baku. I want to talk a little bit about the UK's NDC, which has been labelled by the WRI as a shining light. They joined Brazil and the UAE as being, this is the assessment of being on the path to reach net zero by 2050. What's your sort of interpretation of the UK NDC on that?
Well, firstly, it's not a new target. So it's sort of heralded as a new target. It's actually just part of what's called the balanced net zero pathway from the government's advisory body. And I'm quite clearly using that language, the government's advisory body, the Committee on Climate Change. They're not an independent organisation. But so they have produced a pathway for the UK government. And this 81% figure is actually just on that pathway. And that pathway was produced quite a few years ago. So it's not some tightening of the existing commitments, really. And also it's worth pointing out that the 81% excludes international aviation and shipping. And as the Committee on Climate Change note in their letter to the minister, which was, I think, the 24th of October, if you include aviation and shipping, it's about a 77 to 78% reduction compared with 1990. That's important to remember. So it's about a 50 to 55% reduction compared with where we are today. I mean, it's I was about to say it's moving in the right direction. I think that language is misleading. It's certainly an ongoing reduction in emissions. But what is concerning to me is that when you just do some basic arithmetic applied to the science related to carbon budgets that align with our Paris commitments, you come up with quite a different sort of headline narrative, if you like. So the carbon budgets associated with the 81% reduction for the UK are about threefold greater than the UK would have if you were to take the global carbon budget for 50% chance of 1.5 and divide it by all the citizens of the world on an equal per capita basis. Now, remember, that's not fair. That ignores all of our historical emissions. That ignores the concept of common but differentiated responsibility. So it ignores all the equity commitments that the UK has signed up for at every agreement going back to 1992. So it ignores those and just says every citizen is going to get the same. If you do that, the UK is getting 3 times more than its fair allowance under 1.5 degrees centigrade. And it's also worth bearing in mind that the senior person from the Committee on Climate Change who signed the letter to the minister on the 24th of October recently had an academic paper out that showed what the carbon budget was globally. So I'm using his global carbon budget, his letter to the minister, and just a bit of arithmetic shows that the letter to the minister is deliberately misleading. It is not in line with 1.5. I think it would be reasonable to say on an equal per capita basis that it is in line with 2 degrees centigrade, but it is not in line with 1.5. It is about 3 times greater than what would be fair. Now, I accept the fact that UK always thinks it should get more than everyone else. So there's sort of the neo-colonial view of the UK. And if you took that view, yes, of course, the UK should have 3 times more than every other person in the world. That's the usual sort of historical approach of the UK. But actually, if you unpick that, I would think most people say that's an unfair framing of what we should do on climate change. So it is deeply misleading. I wouldn't say it's a shining light. It's a small candle flicker from a very, very dark background on climate change. That's all it is. So there's no shining light in there.
Okay. And the fact that we're at a COP at a time like this when there's so much scandal going on, it's kind of ridiculous. Is the UK a leader, or is
Oh,
it just a leader at a time when everyone else is so bad it's not that difficult to seem like a leader?
the UK has always been remarkably slick at PR. We've spent the last few hundred years developing that skill. So, we demonstrated that really at Glasgow, I think, which was a terrible COP. I don't think we've had a reasonable COP since Paris, to be honest. And we are very good at sort of slick PR. If you use that sort of lens, then the UK is demonstrating some leadership. If you stand back and do anything sort of analytical around it, no, the UK is not showing leadership. Just because there are other countries that are not doing very well as also is no reason for us to stand up and say we're doing better than the really bad ones. And in fact, we're not anyway. I mean, there are many other countries that emissions per capita are much lower than ours. There are even some within the European Union that are much lower than ours. So, so neighbours of ours in the European Union that have lower emissions per capita than we do. And it is true the UK has managed to bring its emissions down quite rapidly, but that has been brought down really only in the electricity sector. So the other sectors really have remained very high, pretty much static, or some of them have actually gone up. And the electricity sector was quite easy in the UK because we were dominated by coal. So we have taken coal off the grid, and that's important. But that's a one-off. Once you've done it, you've done it. The UK is now, with the current administration, locking itself into ongoing more gas, into hydrogen, into LNG. And it's worth bearing in mind that the carbon budgets that we have assume we're going to have very large reductions in methane emissions. So the UK would have to have at least a 30 to 40% reduction in methane emissions by 2030 if the carbon budgets are to hold. And yet the UK government is obsessed by gas. It's going to be moving towards more and more LNG, which has higher and liquefied natural gas, which has higher and higher methane emissions compared with piped gas. So we are locking ourselves into a high methane future. That high methane future means that the carbon budgets that we have are actually too high anyway. And as it is, those carbon budgets we're going to exceed by a factor of 3 for 1.5 degrees centigrade. So at no point in this is there any quantitative or moral leadership. And I think this comes down to the point is we've left everything so late, not just the UK, but globally, that the changes we need now, and I would say the change we've needed almost for the last 10 years at least, are profoundly political. They're cultural, they're social, they're economic, as well as technological. And yet the only tool in the box by most governments is technology. And technology cannot deliver in the time frame that we have. So whilst it's a prerequisite, it simply cannot deliver. And every government is running scared of saying we need to consider serious sort of social change in values, in norms, in expectations. And let's also be clear, I'm talking about those things in relation to the high emitters in our society. And that's true in China and India as much as it is in the UK. Most emissions, as I always say, most emissions do not arise from the average person in our society. They arise from the group of us who have normalized our high consumption norms. And we are the ones that are unprepared to have questioned issues of social norms, of political acceptability, all of these things. And so we're reliant on technology. And the UK government has completely swallowed that as well. More disturbing still, probably because they have the purse strings of the academics. The academic realm, the expert realm, has been deeply co-opted. And so it will very seldom talk about these bigger sort of social repercussions. And I think that was evident going back to the first point about the 81% reduction. Where were the academics saying that the Committee on the Climate Change letter to the minister was somewhere between hugely mistaken or deeply dishonest? Where were the academics? Where were the journalists? Not one that I heard spoke out. It's just science and arithmetic. So there's been a deliberate silence, or often even support, of the CCC's position by the expert community. So the level of co-option is really deep. Not only are we seeing the COP that you're at, which effectively is just a place for oil contracts to be exchanged. Not only are we seeing that, but we're seeing that the governments have been hoodwinked into think we can do all this with technology, and the expert community has been deeply co-opted as well.
This week, I've spoken to the vice chair of the IPCC, Diana Worsat.
Yeah.
She put a lot of emphasis on reducing the demand for fossil fuels is where we've got to really put the pressure. And then we did speak to the sitting chair of the UK Climate Change Committee, Piers Forster, and he was saying, well, CCS, we were questioning the CCS element of it, and he was saying that's necessary, and they're not investing the money; they're underwriting the investment from the private sector over 25 years.
Yeah.
And then we come to you mentioned the 1.5 and 2 degrees. When you put all of this together, and I remember Jim's here recently, he said we've missed 1.5 degrees. We're on path for over 3, which being here, seeing how deals are done completely contrary to what this is meant to be about. It strikes me that there isn't a hope in hell that we're going to stay with under 2. And the 2.7, the pledges, I don't think anyone's taking those pledges seriously. So,
no, firstly, on the pledges, the 2.7, let's be really clear about this. This is not about the pledges. It's about what the academics and the experts choose is going to happen after 2030. The NDCs only really go out to 2030 and are a right mixed bag of things that are very hard to bring together. So when we say that that current pledges and promises are in line with 2.7, a large part, the majority of that in line with 2.7 are the bits that the experts are bolting on to the back end of the NDCs. So deep optimism by the experts. So the 2.7 only holds if all of these other things that the experts are putting in actually end up working. The NDCs themselves do not take us in that direction. The NDCs at the moment take us to roughly the same emissions in 2030 as we have today. So there's no real reduction in emissions with the NDCs at a collective level. We have to be very careful about when people say these are in line with whatever, because that's usually because some optimistic expert has assumed lots of technology in the future. It's not because of the pledges. I would caution against, in fact, I would disagree with the point we haven't got hope in hell of staying below 2 degrees centigrade. If the carbon budgets that people like Piers Forster and Robin Lamble and others are putting out for 2 degrees centigrade, I think to say that they're not possible now is dangerous, because I don't think it's true. I think it's fair to say that there is absolutely no evidence from the political moves of any country that we're going to move in that direction. But they give us sufficient leeway, if those budgets are correct, that we could make rapid and deep changes. Now, I think it is fair to say now that if the budgets are right for 1.5, not a hope in hell of staying below 1. Or not going above 1.5. And that's what annoys me about Piers Forster in the letter to the Committee on Climate Change. He's the one that signed the letter, and it's his paper that gives the budgets so small that we can't stay below 1.5. So we're holding inconsistent views at the same time. But I'm not of the view that 2 degrees C has gone. By 2030, early 2030s, the challenge we will face for 2 degrees centigrade, if we don't reduce our emissions rapidly from now, is the same as we face with 1.5. So within 5 years, I would say that we've wiped out the chance for 2 degrees centigrade, because if we're saying 1.5 isn't possible now, effectively 2 degrees centigrade is in the early 2030s in the same position. So that tells us something. We've got to be rapidly reducing emissions as of today, as of now. And if we were to do that, if we were to drive emissions down, 2 degrees centigrade is still viable. And to drive it down would be a mixture of technology and major social change, particularly forced upon the high emitters principally. I don't think that's likely. So if someone said to me, if you were to provide a likelihood on that, no, I don't think it's likely. I think it's very unlikely. It is impossible if we don't try. I come to the view now that I don't think 1.5 is possible, even if we tried. I just don't think we can do that. And I was saying that with a very heavy heart, because that's basically the high emitters amongst us have deliberately and knowingly decided that our hedonistic pleasures are more important than the lives and livelihoods of poorer people in climate vulnerable communities, and indeed the well-being of our own children. That's a deliberate choice we have made. We can't claim willful ignorance on this anymore.
When I interviewed you in Paris, you said it will be very, very hard to stay within 1.5. We're 9 years on with all the cumulative emissions.
There's an ongoing challenge, I think, for those of us who engage in the numbers, is that as we understand the science better, then the carbon budgets change. So there was a time when the carbon budgets, like for 1.5, were much smaller. Then they grew a little bit from our understanding of the science. Now they're shrinking again a little bit more as we're understanding what's the effect of aerosols. Over time, science certainly, we see a very significant progression in our understanding of climate using the standard tools of science. And so I think now we're in a much better position to give a feel of how much emissions we can emit for a given temperature. Now, there's still a lot of uncertainties around these things, but by and large, we have a good handle on the numbers that are sufficient to give us a very robust view of what policy needs to deliver. And that's why I think the work of Lamble and Piers Forster are really helpful here. But it is also possible that people like Jim Hansen and others may be correct, and that, in fact, the climate sensitivity is much more challenging than the standard science would suggest. And Jim might be right on this. But I think we are at the point now, what we know for 1.5 and 2, we know what the most optimistic interpretation is. And I would say that's Lamble and Piers Forster. And they are enormously challenging themselves. If people like Jim are right, then we're probably already locked in 2 degrees centigrade anyway.
I first interviewed Jim Hansen in 2012, and he said, if we wait a decade before we reduce our emissions, then I don't think it's doable to hold on to a stable climate. Now, I'd say we've surpassed his expectations of going in the wrong direction in some ways.
It's got much, much worse in that decade. I mean, that decade it's not far off. It's less, but it's not far off 500 billion tons of CO2, 500 billion tons. I mean, since Paris, we put out 1/3 of a trillion tons. Since the UNFCCC in 1992, or thereabouts, we put out almost 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I mean, the problem we face now is not the problem we faced in Paris, and that was not the problem we faced in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. The problem is far more challenging today. And there is an issue about risks and consequences. If Jim is right, and there's certainly, I mean, his science is robust, as is the work of Lamble and Forster. It's just that there are slightly different interpretations of some things we don't fully understand. But if Jim's view is right, then we are in a terrible position on climate change. And I personally think from a policy perspective, the risks and consequences issues are what we need to focus on. The risk might be quite small, but if the consequences are dire, then you do everything you can to avoid even that small risk. But what we're doing, we're seeing the consequences look absolutely terrible, and we're prepared to take large risks. So we're now taking large risks with dire consequences. So we really have got that balance incorrect. And I repeatedly harp on everywhere, social media, everywhere I speak, anything I write, that the expert community has to start to come out and be honest and frank, and not fearful of business as usual, not fearful of our paymasters, of being discredited by our colleagues who don't like what we say. They don't disagree with it, they just don't like it. So there is a real role for us as the experts to start to hold our paymasters to account.
A few years ago, I think it was just before Glasgow, you released a paper about this. And it was about if the experts actually spoke out and if the experts sided with society instead of with the elite, then there was a potential. It's like a sort of social change mechanism. Do you still sort of hold to that?
Well, I still hold to the point. I mean, not for 1.5, but yes, I mean, for 2 degrees centigrade.
I mean, for social change.
Social change that would now be necessary for 2 degrees centigrade will absolutely require the academic community to be honest. And a good example, which I've already touched on, is the Committee on Climate Change's letter to the UK government. That there was complete silence in the academic community. In fact, I've seen colleagues who I have a lot of time for now referring to it, and isn't this a positive move forward, and this is the sort of things we need to be doing. This is terrible. Privately, they're not saying that. When I talk to them, they go, no, we know it's nothing like in line with Paris. Well, say that then. Say that honestly. Without the honesty from the experts, it's not enough, but is an absolute prerequisite. How can wider civil society, how can businesses, how can policymakers start to think about what the appropriate response might be if, in fact, the expert community has decided to be dishonest?
So you think there's a widespread lack of courage?
Yeah, widespread lack of courage. And the problem, it's gone on for so long, because it's not just new. It's gone on for so long that it's turned into like some sort of collective delusion. Now, the good thing about it is that it doesn't take much of a scratch on the experts' skin for them to feel incredibly uncomfortable, because we all know that we've been deluding ourselves and everyone else. But if you're there with other people who are happily doing it, you sort of fall in with it. And as soon as someone steps up and sort of says, look, the emperor's naked, I think actually the house of cards could collapse. But it does require people to stand up. And unfortunately, the expert community has principally been bought. I think it's bought in lots of ways. And this isn't my area of expertise, but you can certainly see it from a prestige point of view. If you're prepared to stand up, you know you won't be invited to the fancy dinners, you won't be getting the gongs, you won't be getting the awards, you won't be getting the funding. So these things go to people who support the status quo. And the UK is a wonderful example of that because it loves the idea of awards and gongs for people who aren't rocking the boat. You can look at our awards list, see on climate change who has got those knighthoods and who's got the MBEs and the OBEs and the other awards. And they're the ones who have not said boo to the system. My concern here, and it's not always the case, is that I think there's a lot of reliance on the earlier career researchers and academics and experts to stand up. There are some others speaking out. I mean, people like John Schellenhuber has spoken out. Even Johan Rockström, though not on what we need to do about it, he's still very, very weak on that. But on the science, he's very good on the tipping points and pointing out how dangerous it is. But then when it comes to what we need to do about it, it's usual sort of fluffy business as usual nonsense. But I do think we as the expert community need to stand up and be counted. And I think that would at least give civil society a much stronger lever, and the legal system as well, which is important here. I get involved in lots of legal cases. All the work I do is pro bono. But what you find is that on the other side, the developer will always have some co-opted academic being paid a fortune to say why it is that this shale gas development, this oil development, this airport, all these things are perfectly reasonable and in line with net zero 2050. And yet virtually never will you find that, well, very seldom you find climate academics prepared to stand up against the status quo in a court and say, here's some evidence on climate change that you need to be considering. And I think there is a significant potential for the legal system to change planning and development. It sounds like dry stuff, but this is really important. You start to change the norms of our society. And again, coming back to the UK, that starts to happen. The planning rules are different. They can now question issues of climate change, which they couldn't question before. That's allowed now in planning in the UK. And so there's a real role for us as academics to provide expert evidence in court cases, but we're not.
There's a sort of limited window in the cycle of democracy in places like the UK. As it does seem that we're not really articulating our better view of the future very well.
Yeah, no, we're terrible. I mean, that numerous times it's like that. I mean, my take on this is I think this was evident in Brexit in the UK and it was evident with Trump in the US. I don't blame people voting Brexit. I didn't vote Brexit. I'm quite honest about that. But I can completely understand why people voted Brexit. I completely understand why people vote for Trump. Because the establishment, and in that, of course, a lot of the scientific experts, hasn't really not cared about Dust Belt America for the last 30 or 40 years. They should have done. They always claimed to do. They pretended to be the voice, the Democrats, the voice of these people. They didn't care about them. The same over here in the UK. The establishment didn't care about the people living in the more working class communities, the old mining communities, the manufacturing hubs that have been demolished and decimated. So when these people, and it was primarily these people that were significantly voted for things like Brexit, us middle class folks stood up and said, oh, it's terrible. Well, no, why did we show no concern for them? And that's because we didn't sell a positive narrative for them. We could have sold a positive narrative about Brexit. The Democrats could have sold a positive narrative in the States. We could sell a positive narrative about climate change. Most people in wealthy countries will do much better with proper responses to climate change, regardless of the emissions. It's better for our jobs, it's better for our job security, it's better for our children's health, it's better for our homes, it's more affordable heating, it's more affordable public transport. The problem is those of us who are responsible for most emissions will have to pay for that. And we do not want that. And so we will not provide a positive narrative until, and again, it comes back to, until the expert community is honest, why would you ever produce a positive narrative about climate change? Because that positive narrative for most people is not positive for those of us who are responsible for most of the emissions. And we are the ones that frame the debate on climate change. The academics, the policymakers, the journalists. And I think the journalists, along with the academics, take some significant responsibility here on issues of climate change. It is their job to be more investigative. It is their job to, maybe not to paint the positive narratives, but at least to describe what these things might mean in a language that's more amenable to other people. And I think journalists have actually failed there as well, with a few exceptions.
It comes back to this idea of the status quo, and it comes back to the COP. The COP itself, I mean, there's a side to this which is quite amazing. You do meet really amazing people. You see things going on at a subnational level, which are really quite inspiring. You see people meeting and talking and galvanizing and their sort of momentum and community and all this kind of stuff. But the overarching structure is completely toxic. I mean, before you even come here, the organizers very clear that they want to triple their exports of gas. They're doing deal. They get caught in a sting and then make a comment about God-given rights and this kind of thing. Then, I'm talking to people who just openly say, yeah, my minister's off doing a deal and he's got another meeting tomorrow. And you're just sort of eyes popping out of my head. You just think this is insane, given in the next room, you've got Stefan Ramsdorff talking about the AMOC collapsing 50-50 chance. And you just think, was this some sort of peculiar nightmare?
The whole climate realm is, in terms of what we should do about it, is just awash with lies and delusion. And the COP is a very good example of that. I mean, the COPs as they are completely unfit for purpose. Now, we do need some negotiations, obviously without a doubt, but I think all of the other shenanigans around it, they shouldn't be there. I'm aware that I'm speaking as a privileged white person in the Northern Hemisphere. And I have colleagues who I have a lot of respect for from the global South who say that at least in the COP, their voices are heard. My concern, and they could be right on this, so I'm aware that I'm coming at it from a certain perspective. I don't think they're listened to. So I think that they are heard, and I think that they are tolerated, but I don't think they are listened to. And it's the same way with the activist movements as well. And so I could be wrong on this part. I don't think the COPs do even them a service, but I know that quite a few of my global South colleagues disagree with me on this, and they may well be right. So some form of coming together of negotiators is important. It's absolutely essential, and it needs to be much more balanced, so that the global South voices are, well, at least as loud, if not considerably louder, and listened to more and have more influence in the process than the global North voices. That's not what's happening at the moment. And the other industry fair that goes on around it, and the jollies of people going over there to meet with friends they haven't seen for a while and have meals on someone else's expense, all of that is a disgrace. But it all adds to prestige. It makes us feel we're doing something worthwhile, this big 2-week jamboree every year on climate change. I mean, whilst it's a 2-week jamboree, it demonstrates that we only for 2 weeks of the year we're really concerned about climate change. The rest of the time we're not. So yeah, it's there's something about this that smacks of or that encapsulates our failure, the COPs. So they need to be radically rethought. And we're in this position now, I think, working group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what we need to do about things, that needs a fundamental reform. The COPs need a fundamental reform. The academic community, the expert community that informs a lot of the debates and so forth, that they should be forming the debates, needs to be much more honest. The journalists need to start becoming journalists, investigative journalists, and thinking about things, working hard for their money. They're not doing that. So almost at every level, you can see how that failure is manifest. And coming back to your point earlier about 2 degrees centigrade, at the moment, there's no sign of any of this changing significantly. And if that's the case, then in a handful of years, we'll have written off 2 degrees centigrade as we've already written off 1.5.
I mentioned the AMOC a minute ago, but we don't even have to go to the AMOC. Look at Valencia, look at Central Europe, look at the southern states, look at the Philippines and Colombia, you can just about go anywhere you want to go, basically.
Yeah.
And if, as scientists have said, everything is accelerating, even the accelerating is accelerating, as someone said.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a point where we become overwhelmed by we talk about, Rockstrom talks about this safe operating space for humanity, but it's not very safe for quite a lot of people. And those people are quite often now also in the global North.
Yeah, they are. Yeah.
Because the global South is always out of sight to if you're in Europe or something like that. So is there a point where the whole thing just becomes too much psychologically from incidents or...
Well, I mean, we can, at the moment, in the global North, we can usually bear the brunt of the things that are happening. But Valencia is interesting, but you look at the Spanish economy, it's growing faster than the US economy. So they'll no doubt think that they can buy their way out of these things. But as you point out, the rate of acceleration is accelerating, which actually does, if you're using any indicators, I mean, it's very hard to ever tell where a tipping point is. But I mean, that is one thing that does give you an indicator that you could be moving somewhere there's a different place, a different zone. So once your rate of acceleration is actually increasing, that gives you some indicators that things are going wrong very quickly. But at the moment, I think the wealthy parts of the world simply think we can afford this, what's going on. And remember, the very wealthy of us, who are the ones who are framing the debates, the ones that are at Davos, the ones that will be flying in and out of the COP, but without being seen by most people. These people don't care about what happens in Valencia because they've got a home somewhere else. They don't belong to a country. They belong to an international clique that is beyond national boundaries now. And these are the ones that are structuring the climate debate in many respects. They're certainly the ones that are structuring the economy. So I do think there is something, I'm not always keen on the language, but I think the neoliberal framing of modern society is ill-equipped to deal with the issues that we're facing because those people are isolated from it. They're not held to account in any way, shape or form. And until we do get that, then I think we're not going to succeed. The hope in that, if there is any hope in there, is that they're a minority. And collectives are incredibly powerful. The skill of maintaining the system is to break things down into the individual, not have the power of the collectives. So across the board, the collectives, we have far more power than Musk. We have far more power than the presidents. But the skill of those people is to break us down so that we don't see ourselves as collectives.
Yeah, it's very interesting that when I was in Europe, all I heard was about the US election. Every news channel, every single minute of every single day. Here, I haven't heard his name, haven't heard much about the US at all. Their pavilion is tiny. The Chinese one is the same sort of pavilion the US had in Paris. It's colossal, full of all their aspirations and all the rest of it. But there's a few competitors to that, whereas the US could be just an obscure NGO.
I mean, the US hasn't been involved in the climate debates in any meaningful fashion for a long time, whether they're Democrats or whether they're Republicans. Obama, Trump, Biden, and there are subtle and important nuances. The number of sort of oil and gas permits signed off by Biden are similar in number, maybe slightly more than under Trump. And there's some important differences in there as well. But nevertheless, neither of them are looking to move away from oil and gas. The Inflation Reduction Act, if you compare it with our Paris commitments, it's nowhere. It's a token gesture. But again, the academics, the expert community stayed quiet about this and continues to stay quiet about it. So Trump is no better or worse in relation to Paris. I mean, there might be some small adjustments here and there, but by and large, I don't think the states have been fair players in this for, well, I don't know since when. And you made the point earlier, and I think it's important to come back on this about the chair of the Baku event making the comment about oil and gas being or at least oil being a gift from God. But as I understand it, the speech overall was then saying, as soon as you Europeans wanted a bit of gas, you came running.
Yeah, it's true.
That's an important part of that speech. So yes, it's a very unfortunate form of words to be using at an event like a COP. But it is also incumbent on those of us across Europe to say, yes, we were guilty. As soon as we needed some gas, we would come running. We demonstrated our hypocrisy. And I think that's another important factor to consider. So we have a fairer understanding.
Yes.
Point the finger at other people. The first people to point the finger at is always ourselves. And then once we've done that, we can then start to discuss the role of others.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say that obviously you had Viktor Orban here, who stood up on stage, and he's basically a clown. He behaves like one on the stage and so on and so forth. But he doesn't really have an economy that's based on fossil fuels. Whereas here, they've been very transparent because it's very obvious that their entire economy is based on fossil fuels. I mean, you can smell it when you walk down the street. Yeah. So telling them they've got to shut their economy down is far different to telling Orban just to shut up.
That's an important point. It's one we tried to pull out in some work I did with a colleague a few years ago on the phase-out report for looking at how rapidly we had to phase out oil and gas from the oil and gas producing countries around the world. And just yesterday I was in a discussion with some people writing about what's happening in Norway. I mean, Norway is an incredibly wealthy country, fourth wealthiest country in the world. Its oil and gas is only, say, somewhere between 14, 15, 16% of its GDP. But remember, as income per capita, purchasing power per capita, it's about the fourth richest country. So Norway could quite easily afford to rapidly phase out its oil and gas production. It's got a sovereign wealth fund of $1.3 trillion for a population of under 5 million. So at every single level, Norway ticks the boxes as a country that could rapidly phase out its fossil fuels, and it wouldn't massively impact the well-being of its citizens. And yet it's looking for more oil and gas everywhere it possibly can. Under the Arctic, it's involved in looking at deep sea mining as well. It's behind the Rosebank in the UK. It's behind other projects elsewhere in the world as well. So what we're seeing is it's easy to pick on Baku, Azerbaijan, and so forth. But we also have to look at players like the UK, who's looking ahead to go ahead with the Rosebank field, countries like Norway, the wealthy countries that could rapidly move away from oil and gas because it's not such a large part of their GDP. We're not choosing to do that either. This is my point about right across the board, actually, is that until we get our own house in order, it doesn't lend credibility to our arguments. When we start to do it ourselves, however hard that may be, and talk about that, then we lend credibility to our arguments. So, and that's what you're seeing in COP when they're pointing out oil is a gift from God, and it's one that you Europeans desperately want as well.
It's a successful collective action on their behalf. They give each other cover to keep going, and no one wants to break. So.
No. I mean, there is some. I mean, I don't like the idea of UK leadership because we're always leading on everything, but the Labour Party, the current government, the new government, had said it wouldn't go ahead with any new oil and gas licenses. And then, of course, it is going ahead with Rosebank because it said the Conservatives were going to go ahead with it. But if it's serious about its commitments on climate change, Rosebank is a good bellwether. If we go ahead with it, then they're not really serious about climate change. If they decide to say, no, we're not going to go ahead with it, then that's a good sign. And maybe the UK is demonstrating some leadership as a country that has a reasonable size oil and gas industry that is actually choosing not to use it. The trick then, of course, is we've got to phase out the existing oil and gas very rapidly as well.
Okay. Well, we've actually been much longer than I was anticipating.